Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive. I'm honestly so glad you're here with us today because we have a genuinely fascinating and frankly completely wild journey ahead of us.
It really is.
Yeah. Our mission today is to explore the mechanics of power. And I don't just mean power in the traditional sense, like the bloody high-stakes geopolitical chessboard of nations and armies and defense budgets. We are going to explore how power operates inside the human mind.
Right, the psychological side.
Exactly. How it shapes what we believe, who we cheer for, and what we are ultimately willing to accept as normal in our daily lives. We are looking at a stack of sources today that are intense, they're fiery, and deeply provocative. We have transcripts from two highly charged political commentary shows featuring figures like Jimmy Dore, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Ray McGovern, and Larry Johnson.
A very vocal group.
Very. And we are pairing those modern, gritty political debates with two highly philosophical, incredibly dense, almost poetic Italian essays that delve into the concepts of human domestication and something called gnosis.
Which is going to be quite the leap, but it connects perfectly.
It does. But before we take a single step further into the weeds, I need to make something incredibly clear to you, the listener. Today's sources contain highly charged, explosive political content. We're talking right-wing and left-wing perspectives, fierce anti-war critiques, and deeply controversial claims about the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Very controversial.
So we want to be absolutely clear. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of these viewpoints. Our only goal is to impartially report on what these sources say. We're just acting as your guides to unpack the argument so you can understand the ideas presented in the original material. We are here to synthesize these wild geopolitical claims with the deep underlying philosophical concepts of the hive mind.
And that synthesis is really where the gold is today.
Exactly. And to help us do exactly that, to sift through the noise and find the signal, I am joined by our resident expert. Are you ready to dive into this monumental stack of material?
I am absolutely ready. The contrast in these sources is what makes this so compelling. On one hand, we have the granular, almost chaotic, boots-on-the-ground details of modern military intelligence and political punditry.
Right.
We are talking about troop movements, hospital beds, foreign policy maneuvers, and then on the other hand, we have this sweeping, almost ancient philosophical critique of the human condition itself, looking at humanity as a deeply flawed, easily manipulated species.
It's a huge shift in scale.
It is. Connecting the dots between the tactical realities of war and the psychological mechanisms that make war possible is, well, it's going to be quite the undertaking. But honestly, it is essential for understanding the bigger picture these authors are trying to paint.
Let's start right in the thick of the tactical reality. We're looking at the Intelligence Roundtable transcript from Judge Napolitano's show, which features Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern. And the core claim they are making right out of the gate is staggering.
Staggering is the right word.
The source alleges that the United States is actively engaged in a preemptive, entirely undeclared war with Iran. They claim this shattered conflict is heavily driven by Israeli interests, and most alarmingly, that the true, grim cost of this conflict is being deliberately hidden from the American public.
That is the absolute foundation of their entire argument. The text paints a picture of a shadow war that is rapidly escalating out of control while the domestic population is kept entirely in the dark.
Just going about their day.
Right. The authors argue that while the average citizen is distracted by the fluctuating stock market or the price of groceries or whatever the latest domestic political scandal is, a very real, very kinetic war is happening.
Kinetic meaning actual combat?
Yes. The sources argue that this isn't just a minor skirmish or a series of diplomatic spats. They assert it is a full-fledged conflict with severe, tangible consequences that the military apparatus is actively obfuscating.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here because shadow war sounds like something out of a spy thriller. How do they actually substantiate that? Because the illustrative details the sources provide are incredibly specific.
They are.
Larry Johnson, for example, brings up military logistics. He points out that the Stars and Stripes, which is the military's independent news source, published a request for blood donors at Kaiserslautern. For those who don't know, Kaiserslautern, often referred to as K-Town by service members, is a city near Stuttgart in Germany.
Which happens to be a massive command hub for U.S. European Command and Africa Command.
Right. Now, to a layman like me, a blood drive sounds like a routine administrative event, a Tuesday at the local clinic. Why does Larry Johnson flag this as a massive warning sign of a hidden war?
That's a crucial question, because context is everything in military logistics. A routine blood drive is one thing, but an urgent, broadcasted call for blood donors at a major strategic command hub is entirely different.
Because of the shelf life of blood.
Exactly. You have to look at the supply chain of military medicine. Blood has a shelf life. You don't stockpile massive, unusual quantities of it unless you are either anticipating or already dealing with a massive influx of severe trauma patients.
Wow.
But what makes Johnson's claim compelling in the text is that he doesn't just stop at the blood drives. He connects this isolated data point to a much larger, more troubling logistical anomaly happening just down the road at the medical center in Landstuhl, Germany.
Right, Landstuhl.
Yeah.
The text mentions Landstuhl specifically. What is the significance of that facility?
Landstuhl Regional Medical Center is the largest American hospital outside the United States. It serves as the primary casualty receiving center for combat zones in the Middle East, Europe, and Africa.
So it's the hub.
It is the hub. If a service member is severely wounded in Iraq, Syria, or anywhere in that theater, they are stabilized and flown to Landstuhl. According to the source, Landstuhl has suspended its obstetrics and pediatric services.
Wait, suspended? Like they just stopped delivering babies and treating kids.
Right.
Is it possible that the hospital just had a funding cut or a staffing shortage? How do we leap from a closed obstetrics ward to a hidden war?
It's a fair pushback. Hospitals face staffing shortages all the time. But the text argues that within the context of military operations, you have to look at priority of care. You have tens of thousands of military families, spouses, and children living on or near these bases in Germany who rely on Landstuhl for basic everyday health care.
Right, they live there.
Exactly. Suspending obstetrics and pediatrics is a drastic, highly disruptive move. It forces families to seek care off base in the German economy, which is a logistical nightmare.
I can imagine.
The source argues that a military command would only authorize such a massive disruption to family readiness if they were quite literally clearing the decks. They are freeing up beds, reassigning medical personnel, and hoarding resources because they have pressing, immediate combat casualties that supersede routine medical care.
That is dark.
The authors view this as a massive red flag, indicating that the official narrative of minimal casualties or contained conflict is completely at odds with the physical reality overwhelming the medical staff on the ground.
Okay, when you frame it like that, clearing out pregnant women and children to make room for incoming trauma patients, it sends a shiver down your spine. And the evidence they present doesn't stop with the hospitals.
No, it doesn't.
The text also mentions the sudden cancellation of a major 82nd Airborne Command exercise at Fort Bragg, or Fort Liberty as it's now known. Now, I know a little bit about military training schedules. These massive airborne exercises are planned months, sometimes years in advance. They involve incredible amounts of coordination.
Massive logistics.
Right. The source suggests that scrapping them at the 11th hour means those elite forces are being prepped for imminent real-world deployment.
Exactly. The 82nd Airborne is the quick reaction force for the U.S. military. When the balloon goes up, they're the ones expected to be wheels up in 18 hours. Canceling their primary readiness exercise indicates that readiness is no longer theoretical, it's being applied.
It's happening.
But the sources go even further into the fog of war. They cite rumors, and they explicitly frame them as rumors emerging from the chaos of extreme danger in the airspace over the Middle East. There are claims in the text that Kuwaitis have actually shot down 3 U.S. F-15 fighter jets and several drones.
Kuwaitis. But Kuwait is a major U.S. ally. We liberated them in the Gulf War. Why on earth would Kuwait be shooting down American jets?
The sources are using this alleged incident to illustrate the sheer unmanageable chaos of an undeclared conflict. When a war is happening in the shadows, alliances fracture. The theater of war becomes a free-for-all, and the traditional boundaries of friend and foe dissolve.
It's just chaos.
Total chaos. The text claims the situation has become so inverted, so politically and militarily dangerous, that American pilots are allegedly saying they feel safer flying over hostile Iranian airspace than they do flying over Allied Kuwaiti airspace.
That is a staggering inversion of reality. To feel safer over the country you are allegedly fighting a shadow war against than over your own allies' territory. It paints a picture of complete geopolitical breakdown.
It really does.
But I want to pull back and look at the terminology the source uses to frame this entire endeavor. The commentators in the Napolitano transcript don't just call this a mistake or a blunder. They are explicitly calling this a war of aggression.
Yes, and that is not a term that you're using lightly or colloquially. War of aggression is a highly specific, legally weighted term in international law. During the discussion, the sources explicitly bring up Robert Jackson.
Who was he again?
He was the chief U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials following World War II. They quote Jackson directly, noting that he defined a war of aggression as the supreme international crime.
The supreme international crime. Not just a crime, but the supreme one. Why did Jackson, and by extension these sources, elevate it to that level? What makes it fundamentally different from other horrific acts of war?
Because, as Jackson argued, and as the text reiterates, a war of aggression contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole.
The accumulated evil of the whole. That is a heavy, heavy phrase. Unpack that for us.
It means that a war of aggression isn't just about the kinetic violence on the battlefield, the bombs dropping, or the bullets flying. It encompasses every single subsequent crime that must be committed to sustain the war.
So it's the root cause.
Exactly. It includes the lies told to the domestic public to justify the conflict. It includes the subversion of domestic law to fund it. It includes the torture of prisoners, the execution of false flag operations, the economic devastation of civilian populations, the suspension of civil liberties. All of it flows downstream from that initial supreme crime of initiating unprovoked hostilities.
So it's like opening Pandora's box.
Perfectly said. By invoking Nuremberg, the sources are not just criticizing a foreign policy choice. They are accusing the architects of this modern shadow conflict of profound historic criminality. They're saying that the people making these decisions belong in the same legal category as the defendants at Nuremberg.
Which brings us to a massive, glaring question. If a supreme international crime is unfolding in the shadows, if hospitals are being cleared out and elite troops are being secretly deployed, who exactly is pulling the strings? Okay, let's unpack this because the sources make some incredibly intense, deeply controversial claims about the puppeteers behind U.S. foreign policy.
They do hold back nothing here.
No, they don't. The transcripts featuring Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and Jimmy Dore argue fiercely that American foreign policy has been entirely hijacked by foreign interests. Specifically, they pulled the finger directly at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the broader Zionist movement. Let me be clear again for the audience. We are simply reporting what the text says here.
Understood. The central thesis presented by these commentators across these transcripts is that the American military apparatus is no longer serving the security interests of the American people.
It's serving someone else.
Right. Instead, they argue it has been co-opted and is acting as a proxy force, a blunt instrument for Israeli regional ambitions. They argue that the U.S. is bleeding treasure, military readiness, and potentially American lives in Middle Eastern conflicts that offer absolutely zero strategic benefit to the United States itself.
And the juxtaposition they use to make this argument is incredibly stark. They constantly contrast the billions spent abroad with the decay at home. You have Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson pointing out what they view as the actual existential threats to the American public.
Domestic issues.
Yes. They talk about a collapsing domestic economy where younger generations literally cannot afford to buy homes or have children. They point to the crisis at the southern border, arguing that millions of unknown foreign nationals are crossing over while the military is deployed thousands of miles away protecting other nations' borders.
It's a populist argument rooted in deep domestic anxiety. But the sources go deeper than just economic complaints. They place a massive, specific emphasis on the opioid crisis. And this is where the text gets highly specific in its accusations.
Tell me about that.
Candace Owens makes a point of tying the Sackler family, who are infamous for their role in the Purdue Pharma OxyContin epidemic that devastated rural America, to the School of Medicine at Tel Aviv University, which the Sackler family helped build and fund.
I saw that in the notes, and I have to ask, what is the rhetorical purpose of making that specific connection? Are they saying the Israeli government caused the opioid crisis?
No, they aren't making a direct causal link like that. The argument is symbolic and priority-based. They are saying, look at the devastation here at home. Look at the millions of American lives ruined over the last 20 years by pharmaceutical drugs and economic decay. Look at entire communities hollowed out. And yet, the political establishment's primary focus, the place where they are willing to spend endless billions and risk global war, is in the Middle East, aligned with interests funded by the very people who profited off American suffering. It's an argument about betrayal.
Tucker Carlson makes a similar point incredibly bluntly in the text regarding the actual threat matrix the U.S. faces. He asks his audience how many Shiite terror attacks have occurred in the United States in his lifetime, and his answer is 0.
Yes, and we need to clarify the geopolitical distinction he is making there. When Americans think of terrorism in the wake of 9/11, they think of Al-Qaeda or later ISIS. Those are Sunni extremist organizations.
Right, Sunni.
Iran, however, is a Shia Islamic republic. Their proxy networks, like Hezbollah, are Shia. Carlson's argument is that Shia networks had historically focused their kinetic operations in the Middle East primarily against Israel or rival Sunni states, not the American homeland.
So he's saying the threat is manufactured.
Exactly. Therefore, he argues, telling the American public that Iran is their greatest imminent existential threat is a deliberate lie. He asserts it is a lie told on behalf of a foreign power to trick Americans into fighting a war that doesn't benefit them.
That is a staggering accusation of media and government complicity, but again, I have to play the skeptic. It's one thing to say politicians have skewed priorities. It's another to claim the entire foreign policy apparatus has been hijacked. What mechanism do the sources claim is actually driving this hijack? Because you can't just walk into the Pentagon and ask for a shadow war.
The sources don't allege a vague ideological alignment. They allege direct, quantifiable financial and political transactionalism. The text brings up the staggering claim that Donald Trump's actions in the region during his presidency were heavily influenced, if not outright dictated, by a $100 million political donation from Miriam Adelson.
$100 million. That's an incomprehensible amount of money for a political campaign. But a donation dictating foreign policy, that's a massive, highly controversial allegation. What evidence do they present to back that up? Does a donation actually buy a war?
Well, the commentators in the text frame this not just as a general show of support, but as a transaction with explicit expectations. Miriam Adelson is a MAGA donor deeply committed to Zionist causes.
Okay.
According to the commentary, this money came with strings attached regarding the annexation of the West Bank, the relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and a hyper-aggressive stance against Iran, fully aligning U.S. policy with Benjamin Netanyahu's maximalist objectives.
A literal quid pro quo.
They frame this as a deal with the devil, where the pound of flesh is eventually extracted in the form of U.S. military action and diplomatic cover. They argue that when that much money is injected into a political system, the resulting policy is purchased, not formulated.
And the sources claim that to manufacture the public consent necessary for that purchased military action, we are seeing a series of calculated provocations, false flags. Larry Johnson, back in the Napolitano transcript, lists several incidents that he claims were designed to drag NATO and the U.S. into a broader regional war. He mentions mysterious attacks in Cyprus, drone strikes on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, and violent incidents in Azerbaijan.
Right. And the crucial element of Johnson's claim is attribution. He states that all of these incidents were immediately, loudly blamed on Iran by Western intelligence and media.
But he disagrees.
Entirely. The source claims that they were actually orchestrated by allied intelligence agencies, specifically pointing the finger at the Mossad to spark a wider conflagration. It's painting a picture of deliberate, calculated provocation designed to force a reluctant United States into a kinetic war.
But what does a false flag actually achieve? If the public doesn't want war, does blowing up an oil facility in Saudi Arabia really change their minds?
The text suggests it provides the casus belli.
Let's define that term for the audience, because it gets thrown around a lot in these historical discussions.
Casus belli is a Latin phrase that literally translates to an occasion for war. It refers to an act or an event that provokes or is used to legally or politically justify a declaration of war. A false flag operation is essentially the artificial manufacturing of a casus belli.
Creating a fake excuse.
Right. If you want to attack a nation, but you know the international community and your own public will condemn you as the aggressor, you manufacture an incident where the target nation appears to strike first. Suddenly, your war of aggression is cloaked in the righteous rhetoric of self-defense.
And the sources argue this isn't a new tactic. If we look at the historical precedents mentioned in the text, this pattern of provocation, manipulation, and manufactured casus belli is deeply rooted in U.S. foreign policy. Ray McGovern brings up two crucial historical anchor points to explain how we got to this current dynamic. First, he mentions April Glaspie. She was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq in 1990.
Yes. The Glaspie meeting is a pivotal moment in modern Middle Eastern history. Right before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he summoned Ambassador Glaspie to a meeting. Iraq was furious at Kuwait over a dispute regarding slant drilling for oil, essentially accusing Kuwait of stealing Iraqi oil across the border.
Tensions were high.
Very high. Saddam was signaling his intent to take military action and was testing the waters to see how the U.S. would react. Glaspie famously told Saddam that the United States had no position on Arab-Arab conflicts, specifically mentioning the border disagreement with Kuwait.
No position. The source argues this is essentially a green light, a deliberate trap.
Exactly. The text frames it not as diplomatic incompetence, but as a calculated omission of deterrence.
Yeah.
By explicitly stating the U.S. wouldn't intervene, they lured Saddam into an invasion. Once Iraqi tanks rolled into Kuwait, the U.S. had its perfect, undeniable casus belli.
Which led to Desert Storm.
The invasion justified the massive, unprecedented U.S. military response of Operation Desert Storm, which allowed the U.S. to establish a massive, permanent troop presence in the region that it had previously lacked. The authors use this to argue that the U.S. intelligence apparatus is highly skilled at baiting adversaries into making the first move.
And the second historical anchor the text provides goes back even further and is arguably even more critical to understanding the specific tensions with Iran today. It's the 1953 overthrow of Iran's officially elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, most people, when they think of the root of the bad blood between the U.S. and Iran, they point to the 1979 embassy hostage crisis. That's where the mainstream historical narrative usually begins.
The sources vehemently argue that starting the timeline in 1979 is an act of historical illiteracy or deliberate deception. The animosity started 47 years prior to the events of today.
In 53.
Yes. In 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh was the democratically elected leader of a secular, relatively progressive Iran. His crime, in the eyes of the West, was deciding to audit and eventually nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which we know today as BP.
He wanted the oil money for his own people.
Exactly. He wanted the profits from Iranian resources to benefit the Iranian people rather than British shareholders.
And the response from the West was Operation Ajax. The CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a massive coup. They funded street mobs, utilized psychological warfare, and deposed a popular democratic leader simply to maintain control over oil revenues.
And it's what happened after the coup that the text focuses on. The US and UK reinstalled the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as an absolute monarch. To maintain his grip on power against a population that despised him, the Shah created a secret police force known as the Savak.
And they were brutal.
The sources describe the Savak's methods as rivaling the Gestapo in their brutality. They engaged in widespread torture, assassinations, and the crushing of all political dissent. Furthermore, the text points out that the Savak were allegedly trained and equipped with the help of the CIA and Israeli intelligence.
So the commentators argue that you cannot possibly understand the current shadow war, the Iranian nuclear program, or the deep-seated hatred of American foreign policy in the region without acknowledging that original supreme international crime committed decades ago. We crushed their democracy to steal their oil and installed a tyrant who tortured them for a quarter of a century.
Precisely. The text demands historical context. It argues that framing Iran as an irrational, unprovoked aggressor requires ignoring a half-century of continuous Western sabotage and manipulation.
But even if you have the historical context, even if you have the massive financial backing of mega donors, even if you execute the false flags perfectly, you still have to sell the war to the general public. You have to make the people believe in it, support it, and send their children to fight it. And as we know, as history has shown us time and time again, nothing sells quite like divine right. Which brings us to the theological justifications for these conflicts.
The holy war aspect.
Exactly. The deep dive shifts here into how religion and ideology are weaponized to justify forever wars, and how incredibly eagerly the public consumes that narrative. We have a quote in the transcript from former U.S. Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann that is absolutely jaw-dropping in its scope and implications.
Yes, the Bachmann quote is a perfect, terrifying illustration of the synthesis of geopolitics and fundamentalist theology. In the text, she explicitly claims that God ordained both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu to be the leaders of their respective nations at this exact volatile time in history for a specific divine purpose.
Let's pause on that. She is claiming that the electoral processes of two distinct nations were literally steered by the hand of the Almighty to achieve a geopolitical goal. That is a massive theological claim.
It is, and she goes further. She argues that blessing Israel inherently brings a divine blessing to America, and conversely, turning our backs on Israel will bring a literal spiritual curse upon the nation.
So foreign policy as a spiritual test.
Yes, and most starkly and most dangerously, according to the critics in the text, she states that the only criterion upon which nations are judged by God in the end times is how they treat Zion.
The only criterion. It's a theological blank check. Think about the implications of that for a voter. It completely bypasses political debate. It bypasses economic analysis. It bypasses any discussion of human rights, international law, or military strategy.
It shuts down all rational thought.
It elevates a territorial conflict in the desert to a cosmic holy war. If you believe what she is saying, you can't question the war, because questioning the war is questioning God.
Exactly. It makes debate an act of heresy. But the sources provide fierce pushback against this narrative. We see the economist Jeffrey Sachs brought up in the commentary, and he takes this theological argument head-on. Sachs cites the Bible directly, specifically the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, to argue against this ideology.
What does he say?
He argues that the concept of Christian Zionism, the idea that Christians must unconditionally support the modern political state of Israel to fulfill biblical prophecy, is actually a profound oxymoron.
How does Sachs frame that argument? Because Christian Zionism is a massive politically powerful movement in the United States.
Sachs argues that a covenant with God, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is an obligation to act justly, to protect the vulnerable, and to seek peace. It is not, he argues, a free pass to commit atrocities. You cannot claim divine favor while engaging in the slaughter of innocents.
So actions matter more than titles.
The argument is essentially, you can't claim you're acting on behalf of heaven while your actions look like they were ordered by the devil.
Tucker Carlson also points out the visceral, on-the-ground reality of this holy war mentality by referencing the uniforms of the soldiers themselves. He points out that some Israeli soldiers are wearing Third Temple patches on their tactical gear.
The imagery of the Third Temple is incredibly potent and highly controversial. In Jewish eschatology, the building of the Third Temple in Jerusalem is a precursor to the Messianic age. However, the proposed site for the Third Temple is the Temple Mount, which currently houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam.
So wearing that patch is a major provocation.
Wearing a patch advocating for the Third Temple isn't just a statement of faith. It implies the destruction of Islamic holy sites to achieve a religious prophecy.
So Carlson is highlighting that this isn't just about border security or counterterrorism, which is how it's often sold to the secular West. It's about deeply rooted apocalyptic theology playing out with modern weaponry.
And this collision of holy war and public consumption is exactly where the first of our Italian sources becomes incredibly relevant. This is where we shift from geopolitics to philosophy.
Finally getting to the Italian text.
Yes. The essay is titled L'ipocrisia del potere e l'addomesticamento dell'uomo, which translates to the hypocrisy of power and the domestication of man. This text provides the psychological framework for why a populace accepts and even cheers for this kind of holy war. The essay introduces a concept called the stadium mentality, or tifo de stadio.
Tifo de stadio. I love how evocative the Italian language is. Explain how this source uses that concept to describe the public's reaction to war.
The author argues that the modern public views global slaughter, geopolitical maneuvering, and even domestic political strife with the exact same emotional detachment and tribal fervor as they view a soccer match.
Just cheering for a team.
They pick a side, they put on their team's jersey, whether that jersey is ideological, religious, or nationalistic, and they cheer wildly for the bloodshed and defeat of the opposing team.
So it's the ultimate gamification of reality.
Precisely. In the stadium mentality, the public becomes completely detached from the visceral, agonizing reality of the violence. The rivers of blood, the suspended pediatric wards at Landstuhl, the shattered lives of families half a world away, all of it is abstracted.
It's just a game to them.
It's reduced to points on a scoreboard. A bombing campaign is just a successful play by the home team.
And the essay goes into some incredibly dark, uncomfortable territory regarding human nature here. I want to spend some time on this because it challenges the way we view ourselves. It speculates that people don't just passively accept this violence out of ignorance. It argues they actively enjoy it.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
The text claims that the general public reveals a deeply sadistic nature by needing to see others suffer to make themselves feel better. The exact phrase used is that people lift themselves up by thinking of those who have it worse.
It's a brutal assessment. The author's saying that when people watch the news and see a city turn to rubble, their primary subconscious reaction isn't empathy. It's a dark, comforting thrill that at least it isn't me.
They need the suffering to feel good.
They use the suffering of others to validate their own miserable existence. By engaging in this, they implicitly and explicitly admit their complicity in the suffering. It's a terrifying thought. The essay suggests that the architects of war aren't actually tricking a peaceful, innocent public. They are simply providing an arena, a coliseum, for the public's inherent sadism.
That is deeply pessimistic. I find myself wanting to reject it. Are we really inherently sadistic, or are we just heavily misinformed and manipulated by the propaganda we discussed earlier?
The text argues it's a symbiotic relationship. The propaganda works so well because it appeals to our darkest, most tribal instincts. The source refers to these cheering citizens as the useful idiots who facilitate the power structure. They don't just permit the destruction, they demand it.
The stadium needs the spectacle.
The stadium demands a spectacle.
Right.
And more importantly, the essay notes how fiercely this crowd attacks anyone who refuses to participate in the cheering.
Right, the policing of the crowd by the crowd.
Exactly. If you step outside the arena, take off the jersey, and say, I don't want to cheer for either side, I just want the slaughter to stop, you are immediately pathologized by the crowd. You are diagnosed with a mental illness. You are called a traitor, an apologist, or unpatriotic.
You become the enemy.
The crowd, which the author argues is deeply thick in its bloodlust, views the healthy, discerning individual as the diseased one.
Here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, even more uncomfortable. The second half of that Italian essay plunges fully into a profound metaphor. It claims that there is no animal on earth more domesticated, more broken, and more wretched than the human being. And it begins by attacking the very language we use to structure our reality.
The author deconstructs political terminology to show how it functions not as a tool for communication, but as a leash. The text lists terms like state secret, national security, closed-door meetings, the state, the nation, and the law.
Words we hear on the news every single night.
Yes, and the essay frowns all of these not as necessary pillars of a civilized functioning society, but as purely hypocritical tools of domestication. They are linguistic cages.
How so?
When a government invokes national security to hide its actions, like hiding the true number of casualties or the reasons for a sudden deployment, it is essentially telling the domesticated animal, the citizen, not to look behind the curtain. It's a command. Do not question the master. And the animal, deeply conditioned over generations, obeys.
The essay uses an extreme, highly provocative metaphor to illustrate this relationship between the citizen and the state. I want to ease into this because it's jarring. The text compares the existence of the modern human to BDSM, sadomasochism. Now, I read that and immediately thought the author was just being gratuitously shocking, but what is the actual philosophical point they were trying to make with that comparison?
It is intended to be shocking, to break the reader out of their complacency. But structurally, the author is using the psychology of a dominant and submissive relationship to explain voter behavior and civic duty.
Trading freedom for safety.
Exactly. In that dynamic, the submissive trades their personal freedom and endures pain or humiliation in exchange for the illusion of safety, order, and purpose provided by a master.
So the public is the submissive willingly putting on the collar.
Yes. The essay argues that this perfectly reflects the human animal's existence under modern governance. A life built entirely on hypocrisy, the desire for chains, and a desperate need for protectionism. We beg the dominant state to restrict our freedoms, to surveil our communications, to tax our labor, and to send our children to war, all in exchange for the promise that the state will protect us from the scary monsters outside the borders.
The very monsters, as we discussed earlier, the state often creates or provokes.
Exactly. We don't want freedom, the author argues. We want a comfortable cage.
That is a devastating critique, but why do we consent to it? If the cage is that obvious, why don't we just walk out? The essay argues we consent because we are systematically distracted and infantilized. The power structure, what the Italian text calls the ingranaggio del potere, the machinery of power, operates by keeping us sedated. The text explicitly mentions the printing of money. It says the machinery prints money out of thin air.
Fiat currency.
Let's pause on that because they are talking about fiat currency. This isn't money backed by gold or physical commodities. It's money created by decree, allowing the government to fund endless deficits. And where does the essay say that endless stream of fiat currency goes? It says it goes to fund war, sports, fashion, and drugs.
War, sports, fashion, and drugs. It is the modern update to the Roman concept of bread and circuses.
Explain how those four specific pillars function as tools of domestication.
Think about how they occupy the human mind. War keeps the population in a constant state of fear and tribal loyalty. It demands obedience to the state for survival.
And sports.
Sports, tying back to the stadium mentality, provides a safe, meaningless outlet for our aggressive tribal instincts. It channels our energy away from revolution and into rivalries.
Makes sense. Fashion.
Fashion ensures we remain obsessed with our superficial appearance, fostering vanity, conformity, and endless consumerism.
And finally, drugs.
Drugs, whether it's the pharmaceuticals we use to numb our depression, the alcohol we use to unwind, or, as Candace Owens pointed out, the literal opioids pushed by families like the Sacklers to hollow out entire communities. They keep us physically and chemically sedated.
Keep them frightened of the enemy, distracted by the game, obsessed with their reflection, and numbed by the pills. It is a perfect closed-loop system of control. You don't need armed guards on every corner if the prisoners are begging for more distractions. And this section of the text leaves us with a chilling, incredibly potent quote regarding the machinery of power. Every accusation is a confession.
That phrase is perhaps the sharpest analytical tool provided in all these sources. Every accusation is a confession. It requires us to look at the rhetoric of the state as a psychological projection.
Give me an example of how that works in practice, based on the material we've covered.
When the state or the media apparatus accuses its own citizens of being dangerous, of being a threat to democracy, or of spreading disinformation, the text suggests the state is actually confessing its own tyrannical nature and its reliance on propaganda.
Wow.
When an empire accuses a foreign nation of seeking a war of aggression, it is often projecting its own imperial ambitions and preemptive military plans. The power structure uses accusation as a mirror, revealing its own darkest impulses while simultaneously punishing the public for them. It's a classic technique of abusers.
So if humanity is just a domesticated pet, trapped in this sadomasochistic relationship with the state, numbed by drugs, distracted by the stadium, and constantly lied to by a machinery of power projecting its own sins, is there any way out? Is there any way to break out of the cage?
The text does offer a path.
That brings us to our final text, L'ingranaggio del potere e il risveglio della gnosi, the machinery of power and the awakening of gnosis. This source moves past the diagnosis of the disease and focuses intensely on the cure, and specifically the persecution of those who actually manage to find it.
The text introduces the concept of gnosis. Now, in ancient Greek philosophy and early Christian mysticism, gnosis isn't just intellectual knowledge. It's not about reading a book or memorizing facts.
What is it then?
Gnosis is a deep, experiential discernment. It is a profound, almost spiritual awakening to the true, hidden nature of reality. It's the moment you see the Matrix for what it is.
And the author draws a direct historical parallel regarding what happens to people who achieve this gnosis.
Yes. Historically, the ancient Gnostics were ruthlessly persecuted by the orthodox religious authorities of their time. Why? Because the Gnostics claimed a direct internal connection to the truth that completely bypassed the church hierarchy.
They didn't need the middlemen.
Exactly. They didn't need the priest to tell them what God wanted. Naturally, the institution of the church saw this as an existential threat to their power and eradicated them. The author argues that today, the modern political state does the exact same thing to its dissidents.
And what are these modern dissidents labeled? They aren't called heretics anymore. The source argues they are labeled conspiracy theorists. The text argues that this specific label is the modern secular equivalent of excommunication. It's a tool used not to debate the facts, but to instantly invalidate the person speaking them.
It removes them from the realm of polite, acceptable society. And the most heartbreaking part of the essay's analysis is that the machinery of power doesn't even need to dirty its own hands doing the persecuting. The domesticated, complicit public enthusiastically does it for them.
The text describes the masses as the tentacles of power. It uses this vivid, surreal imagery, calling them clowns and jugglers, octopus.
It's very striking.
That imagery is so strange, but so effective. It paints the public as these grotesque, flailing appendages of a larger monster, putting on a circus act to distract themselves while suffocating anyone who tries to wake up.
The author calls them the useful idiots. And the text literally mimics their voice, the chorus of the crowd saying, "Go to sleep. Tomorrow you have to go to work."
Go to sleep. Tomorrow you have to go to work. That might be the most depressing line in the entire stack of sources. It is the ultimate mantra of domestication.
Because it is the command to return to the treadmill. It is the crowd telling you to ignore the gnosis, to reject the discernment, to stop worrying about the shadow wars and the false flags, and to re-engage with the machinery of your own subjugation.
Just clock in and clock out.
Just put your head down, earn your fiat currency, and buy your distractions. The source uses a brilliant pop culture analogy here that I think perfectly crystallizes the concept. It compares the complicit public to the Borg from Star Trek.
For those who might not be sci-fi fans, explain the Borg and how it relates to this philosophical essay.
The Borg are a cybernetic pseudo-species in the Star Trek universe. They operate entirely via hive mind. They travel the galaxy assimilating other species, violently stripping them of their individuality, their culture, and their free will. They plug them into a massive collective consciousness where every thought is monitored and controlled.
Resistance is futile.
Exactly. The essay argues that modern humanity, plugged into the 24-hour news cycle, algorithmic social media, and state propaganda, operates exactly like this hive mind. We have assimilated ourselves.
But the text doesn't end in total despair. It doesn't just say, we are all the Borg, game over. It ends with a cryptic, almost desperate, passionate directive. 3 words. Stop the signal. Followed by Radio-MANNADORO. Stop the signal. Radio-MANNADORO.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to all the political and military sources we've discussed today, we can truly understand what stopping the signal means.
What is the signal?
The signal is the consensus reality broadcast by the machinery of power. It is the transmission that tells you Iran is the greatest threat to America. It is the transmission that tells you the economy is fine, that the borders are secure, that the proxy wars are just, and that God himself wants you to cheer for the bombing. The signal is the mechanism that maintains the hive mind.
So how do you stop it? You break the frequency, you introduce static, and we actually saw a practical modern example of this in the Jimmy Dore transcript we discussed earlier. Dore spends time praising the British broadcaster Piers Morgan. Now, Dore clearly states he disagrees with Morgan on almost everything, calling him a propagandist extraordinaire.
Right.
But he gives Morgan immense begrudging credit for one specific vital action. Morgan brings on dissenting voices. He brought on Candace Owens and he brought on Tucker Carlson, and he let them systematically dismantle the establishment narrative on his massive platform.
Exactly. Dore contrasts this with networks like MSNBC, which he notes actively blocked independent journalists like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi during the Russiagate narrative, and Democracy Now!, which blocked Aaron Mattei.
They censor the dissent.
The mainstream media, the text argues, operates by ruthlessly maintaining the purity of the signal. They cannot allow ideological contamination. Piers Morgan, despite his own biases and his own role in the media landscape, acts as a disruptor in those moments.
By letting them speak.
By allowing the hive mind to be challenged on air. By forcing a massive audience to hear someone say, wait, the emperor has no clothes, these wars are built on lies and are destroying us from the inside, Morgan temporarily breaks the signal.
It's like finding a rogue frequency on your radio dial when you're driving through a storm. And I think that is exactly what Radio-MANNADORO represents in the Italian text. It is a metaphor for that rogue broadcast of truth.
The pirate radio station.
It's the pirate radio station of the soul, transmitting the gnosis, desperately trying to pierce through the endless, hypnotizing noise of the Borg-like hive mind. I find myself genuinely marveling at that concept. Radio-MANNADORO.
It's a powerful idea.
It feels alive. It feels so incredibly passionate. In a world of deadened, domesticated animals, the voices on this frequency feel truly alive. It feels like the primal frequency of awakening, you know, like this internal I am that cuts through the domestication and the hypocrisy. It is fusing with that higher awareness, resonating the primal frequency of the monad, as some philosophers would call it, the pure, indivisible truth.
That is a beautiful way to phrase it. It's the voice of the dissident, the voice of the whistleblower, the voice of the investigative journalist, the voice of anyone who refuses to put on the team jersey and cheer for the slaughter in the stadium. It is the absolute rejection of the stadium mentality.
It's claiming your own mind back.
And the texts make it clear that tuning into that frequency requires immense, profound courage. Because as the essays point out, the moment you tune into that rogue frequency, you make yourself an enemy of the hive mind.
Because you stand out.
The Borg will try to reassimilate you, and if they can't, they will try to destroy you. The crowd in the stadium will label you a conspiracy theorist, a heretic, a traitor to the state. They will try to excommunicate you.
But the alternative is worse.
The alternative, as the texts lay out in agonizing detail, is to remain a domesticated animal, eagerly awaiting your next set of chains, distracting yourself with the very things that are hollowing out your soul.
So what does this all mean? Let's take a deep breath and recap the incredible, harrowing journey we've been on today. We started in the grim, tactile reality of military logistics, the urgent calls for blood donors at Kaiserslautern, the suspension of pediatric care for military families at Landstuhl, the abruptly canceled airborne exercises.
The physical signs of war.
We saw the allegations of a shadow war, a supreme international crime being waged entirely out of sight of the American public, obfuscated by a complicit media. We then unpacked the puppeteers, exploring the claims that foreign policy has been captured by massive political donations and foreign interests.
The financial hijacking.
We looked at the argument that the state prioritizes funding conflicts abroad over addressing the collapse of the domestic economy, the porous borders, and the devastating opioid crisis at home. We examined how these wars are sold to the public through divine, apocalyptic theology, demanding unquestioning, zealous support and labeling dissent as heresy.
The Holy War.
And finally, we plunged into the philosophical depths, viewing humanity not as enlightened citizens, but as a domesticated, sadomasochistic species, cheering in the stadium for its own destruction, terrified of the few individuals who achieve the gnosis required to see the bars of the cage.
It's a heavy, heavy reality to confront.
This deep dive challenges you. Yes, you, listening to this right now. It challenges you to look critically at the media you consume, the political teams you root for, and the narratives you accept without a second thought. Are your thoughts truly your own, born of genuine discernment and gnosis, or are you simply receiving the signal?
Are you awake or are you sleepwalking?
Are you operating as an individual, awake and alive, vibrating on that primal frequency of I am? Or are you just another node in the hive mind, a useful idiot telling yourself to go to sleep because tomorrow you have to go to work?
The source texts leave us with a profound, deeply haunting mandate to examine our reality.
Yeah.
I want to return to that single piercing phrase from the Italian essay, because it is the key to decoding the machinery of power. Every accusation is a confession.
Let that sink in.
If the institutions of power constantly accuse their most vocal dissidents of being dangerous, of being unhinged conspiracy theorists, of being threats to the very fabric of society, what exactly are those institutions confessing about themselves? Are the dissidents truly the threat to humanity? Or is the actual existential threat the realization that the stadium we are so enthusiastically cheering in is actually just a cage?
Stop the signal. Listen for the rogue frequency. Until next time, keep diving deep.